Gotta catch 'em all. That was the motto for Pokemon in the early days, at least for us in the West. The appeal of catching 151 Pokemon back in the day was a huge deal. Like, this was a 90s Game Boy game, so that felt like an insane amount. Then they added 100 more to the sequels for that same system with the release of Gold and Silver. Obviously, if you're a kid at the time, that label, gotta catch 'em all, well, it had a lot of weight on our young minds. Most of us as kids didn't actually complete our Pokédex, due to things like trading mechanics, a few tricky evolutions, and more obscure catch areas that may have gone over our heads. Now, normally, we'd maybe talk about the most painful Pokemon to catch, or which ones are available the latest in their respective region. But this time, we're gonna take it a little chill and ask, what are some of the Pokemon in this series that are actually ridiculously easy to catch? Which are the ones that we snatch up without even really thinking about it twice? Even though we may associate some of these Pokemon as being likely weaker or not usually a part of the final team, the ones we catch early on are often still a pretty important part of the game, even if it's just to make up for a typing disadvantage, like players that bring Mankey to fight Brock in Pokemon Yellow, since Pikachu is pretty much useless against him. Some are even potential HM slaves, if you're into eating up a party slot for that sort of thing. Anyway, without further ado, let's get straight to the list. It was a tough one to think of what to start with. Actually, this whole concept is actually quite difficult to rank, since most of us don't differentiate one different group of Pokemon from another while we're thinking about the easiest ones to catch. So for number 10, I actually have a group of Pokemon that, while not at all hard to actually catch, maybe aren't always the easiest to get to appear compared to something like a Rattata or whatever. And that would be the Pikachu clones, and of course Pikachu itself. You may not have encountered every Pikachu clone in your journey, but you've probably seen most of them if you've played all of the core games. The biggest exception here is Mimikyu, who is actually not easy to catch, but the ones like Plusle, Minun, and Pawmi contribute to this group being on the list. Here's one that maybe technically is more difficult to catch than some of those Pikachu clones, but is available insanely early. Not only can you get this on Hoenn Route 102, but if it evolves into Gardevoir, while not a fairy type in Gen 3, is still very powerful in Ruby and Sapphire, so it feels like a significant mon to point out. The catch rate is also pretty high. Not to mention, in canon, it also must not be too hard to catch, since it is the first Pokemon Wally ever catches.
Are you kidding me? He found a shiny Ralts!
And yeah, Wally becomes a great trainer, especially in the remix. But at the start of the game, he's a total newbie. So I might be factoring this aspect in just a little bit. Using this Pokemon for the number 8 spot feels a bit strange, since everyone would put this at their number 1. And while this list isn't technically a top 10 in a hardline order, it does feel a little weird bringing it up this early. Yeah, it's Magikarp. Why not save it for last or something? Well, for one, it's too obvious. But also, under certain metrics, it may not be the easiest to catch depending on how you look at it. On a technical level though, it probably is the easiest Pokemon to catch in the series, as you just need an old rod to be used virtually anywhere, and it can't hurt your Pokemon. And also, you need to actually go out of your way to use that item. If you never use it, you may never actually encounter a Magikarp as a wild Pokemon. But that's the thing. When you do get the old rod, chances are you may have at least a small amount of trouble not one-shotting these poor fish by accident. Not that you really need to get its health down much with that high catch rate. But quite frankly, the Pokemon on this list are all arguably equally easy to catch. That's just how accessible some of these are. Originally, this was just going to be a slot for one Pokemon, Poochyena. But I think it's more fair to label this for the early elemental type catches, like electric, fire, and stuff like that. Basically, Mareep fits in this category too. But it's Poochyena I think of first because of how early it shows up in Hoenn, and how unusual it was at the time for a basic dark type to show up so early. Not to mention it's the first Pokemon you have any sort of encounter with when you save Professor Birch. really selling that entry-level encounter vibe more than Wally trying to catch a Ralts. As the series would progress, more of these would pop up earlier in the game, and even the ones that can show up more in the early mid-game, like Vulpix and Psyduck in Gen 1, aren't exactly difficult catches at all either. This entry makes up yet another group of Pokemon rather than a single one, the early birds. Literally the flying types you encounter minutes into your playthrough, like Pidgey and Hoothoot. These vary in difficulty to catch, so I left them at this point on this list. Generally, they're all still pretty easy, but the ones like Hoothoot are a little weird, because you need to be playing at night to catch one. I'm sure there were plenty of kids out there that played Gold and Silver and had no idea where this thing was supposed to be if they never really played the game during night hours. There are also minor little things like Peck not being too great to deal with early on if you chose a grass starter. But I'm sure this is another entry some of you saw coming pretty fast, as the regional bird archetype is one of the most commonly thought of Pokemon to bring on your journey from the beginning. This one is here for similar reasons to Magikarp, in that it doesn't have an attack for a little while, Hoppip. Yeah, in other games, it'll start with Absorb or Tackle in later gens, but for years, it only had Splash to start until level 10. Since you're likely to encounter this mon earlier than Magikarp, chances are you'll have a harder time one-shotting it by accident, though it's still possible, as its stats are pretty terrible even early on. I'm also not really counting this toward the early elemental type group with Poochyena, because it's just flat out easier to catch than all of them. The only thing that adds any difficulty toward catching it is the same thing I said about Hoothoot, which is not being in the area at the right time of day. We talked about Magikarp being practically everywhere when using the Old Rod. Here's the surfing equivalent, Tentacool. It's very rare for a core game to not have these things everywhere. I think exceptions are Gen 5 and games with a National Dex exclusion before any updates. While their catch rate is actually a little lower than these other Pokemon, they're usually able to take a hit, and by the time you get Surf, you'll have damage options that they can resist. So you'll be able to calculate your way into getting a Tentacool to the red zone of health without too much fear of destroying it by accident. There's also no effort in encountering one. As stated with Magikarp, you actually need to go out of your way to use the Old Rod, so you could potentially just never encounter a Magikarp. But Tentacool? You're gonna be sick of this thing, from how much you're gonna bump into it on your way to Cinnabar Island, for example. Thankfully, both Magikarp and Tentacool have awesome evolutions, so these are easy to catch Pokemon definitely worth raising. This one follows the logic of being difficult to accidentally KO most closely, while still having a high catch rate and being easy to come across in most games, Geodude. Usually, you'll come across it early, where you'll still have a bunch of normal moves at your disposal as your regular attack with high PP. Meaning that, once again, this already easy to catch Pokemon becomes even easier to catch due to not being easily fainted by accident, since you have the option to lower its HP slowly after a certain point. With its sturdy defenses, you'll need to be decently overleveled to one-shot it with most hits, assuming it's not like Hyper Beam or something. This makes catching it feel a little more secure than some of the really fragile picks on this list while still being very common. Now, if only completing its evolution was a little easier. I feel like these next two spots are kind of bread and butter of easy to catch Pokemon. For number 2, I'm slotting the regional early game normal types in here, or the regional rodent if you prefer that title. Stuff like Rattata, Sentret, and of course Bidoof. They aren't as sturdy as Geodude, but in this case, you see these so early that this is a good thing, as you're gonna see these when you've just barely gotten started. And causing it to faint by accident just kind of got you some needed early game experience rather than any mild frustration. Everyone has caught one of these during their first playthrough. You may not have used it, but you definitely caught that Zigzagoon, and catching it was about as hard as, I don't know, beating youngster Joey. And finally, we have what is yet another regional trope of the series, the regional bug types. These are pretty much in the same category as the normal types as far as accessibility early on and simplicity, with some of them maybe taking a little more damage. I feel like these and the normal regionals are about equal in terms of easiness. It's just that the bug types are typically a little weaker at their base form. So I think as an all-around choice, I feel like these bug types like Caterpie and Wurmple are just so easy to catch that we don't even think about how easy it is like some of the others on this list like Magikarp. Even some of the evolved forms are insanely easy to catch. Metapod can't even hit back, just casting Harden over and over again, waiting to be caught, raising its defenses, preventing it from fainting easily. It's pretty much just making itself as easy to catch as Magikarp, just with a lower catch rate, but less fragile. Of course, like we said, while some of these are going to be easier than others on the list, we didn't really go out of our way to make this a hardline order, as this is very subjective. These Pokemon are all so easy to catch that you probably barely remember whatever effort you needed to put in to catch any of them. Perfect for beginner trainers. And those are 10 very easy Pokemon to catch. Do you have any others that you think would fit in on this list? Have any of these more humble picks for roster choices like Zigzagoon ever come through for you on your team? Any difficult to catch Pokemon that you had a surprisingly easy time with catching? Let me know down below.